The morning had started like every other morning for Marcus Chen. His alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. in the cramped studio apartment above the Chinese takeout restaurant on Maple Street, and he'd already known it would be a grueling day. As he showered in the tight bathroom with its perpetually leaking faucet, a problem he kept telling himself he'd fix but never did, Marcus thought about the schedule awaiting him at Chen's Auto Repair, the garage he'd managed for the past 7 years. 3 engine overhauls, an alignment job, brake replacements, and at least a dozen diagnostic inspections. It was the kind of day that made his lower back ache just thinking about it. Marcus was 34 years old, though the hardened lines around his eyes and the streaks of gray at his temples made him look older. He'd grown up in this town, born to immigrants who'd owned the takeout restaurant downstairs. His father had always wanted him to take over the family business, but Marcus had inherited a different passion, the mechanical kind. Cars had always made sense to him in a way people rarely did. There was a logic to them, a cause and effect that he could understand and fix. A carburetor was clogged, clean it. Bearings were worn, replace them. The world of engines didn't require the emotional complexity of human relationships. His own marriage had ended 8 years ago, a casualty of long hours, modest income, and his inability to express what he felt. His ex-wife had moved to Philadelphia with their daughter, who was now 12. He saw Emma once a month on weekends, and the visits were always tinged with the awkwardness of a father who'd become something like a friendly stranger. He sent child support payments that ate into his modest salary at the garage, and he'd made peace with the fact that he would probably never be wealthy. But he was good at what he did, and that meant something. The day had been as exhausting as predicted. By the time 4:00 p.m. rolled around, Marcus had been hunched under the hood of a 1998 Chevy pickup truck for most of the afternoon, coaxing a stubborn transmission back to life. His shoulders screamed in protest, and his knuckles were scraped raw from a slipped wrench. He'd sent his coworker, Danny, home early. The younger man had complained about stomach pain all morning, which meant Marcus had to finish the diagnostics alone. When he finally locked up the garage at 6:15 p.m., the sun was already sinking toward the tree line, painting Route 9 in shades of amber and crimson. The drive home took him along the winding highway that cut through the Pennsylvania countryside. It was a route Marcus had driven thousands of times, and he knew every curve, every pothole, every section where the asphalt buckled slightly from the freeze-thaw cycles of winter. He had the radio playing softly, some classical music station that helped him decompress after work, and his mind was already home, thinking about the leftover pad thai he had in the fridge and maybe an early night. He was about 3 miles from the turnoff to his apartment when he saw it. A silver luxury sedan, the kind that looked wildly out of place on this rural stretch of highway, came around the curve ahead at what Marcus immediately recognized as an excessive speed. The afternoon light had been tricky at that exact bend, and the vehicle seemed to have caught someone off guard. Before he could process what was happening, the car's brake lights flared and the sedan began to skid. Marcus watched, almost in slow motion, as the vehicle lost traction. The back end swung out, a fishtail that momentarily corrected before the car's momentum carried it across both lanes. The sedan hit the guardrail at an angle that was almost certainly fatal. The impact crumpled the vehicle's side like paper, and the car bounced backward with a horrifying crunch of metal. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air before rolling, once, twice, 3 times, off the edge of the road and down the embankment. The sound was catastrophic, the shriek of twisting metal, the explosion of glass, the terrible silence that followed. Marcus's hands were already moving before his mind fully engaged. He slammed on his brakes, his truck slowing with a squeal of tires. Without turning off the engine, he grabbed the emergency flashlight from his glove compartment and ran toward the edge of the road. His heart was hammering against his ribs as he made his way down the steep embankment, his work boots slipping on loose dirt and gravel. The sedan lay on its side in a ravine, half buried in overgrown brush and wildflowers. Smoke rose from under the crumpled hood, Marcus could smell gasoline and burned rubber. He forced himself to approach cautiously, aware that the car could catch fire. Through the shattered window of the driver's side, now facing upward, he could see someone inside. A person. Alive, judging by the soft groan that reached his ears. "I'm here, can you hear me?" Marcus called, already assessing the situation like he would a broken machine. The driver's side door was jammed, crushed inward. He tried it anyway, applying his full weight to the handle. Nothing. Moving to what had been the passenger side, now facing the sky, he found the door could open, though it moved stiffly. The window had shattered completely, glass glittering on the fabric interior. The driver was a woman, probably in her mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and a face twisted in pain. She was conscious and struggling, trying to move her legs, but her lower half was pinned under the steering wheel, which had crushed inward during the impact. Her breathing was panicked, shallow. "Don't move," Marcus said, using the steady voice he'd developed over years of dealing with frightened people in bad situations. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay as still as you can. My name is Marcus. What's your name?" "Catherine," the woman gasped. I can't feel my legs. Something's wrong. I can't feel." "It's okay," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure it was. He could see that her legs were indeed crushed and there was blood, not a tremendous amount, which was either very good or very bad. "Help is coming. I already called 911. He hadn't, actually. His cell phone was in the truck. "I need to call them properly. I'll be right back, Catherine, I promise. Don't move." He sprinted back up the embankment to his truck and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher was calm and efficient, and she told him the ambulance was already en route, dispatched when another driver had called in the accident. 14 minutes away, she said. Marcus had never been good at waiting. He returned to Catherine, settling into the uncomfortable position of half crawling into the upended car beside her. He found her hand and held it, a simple gesture, but it seemed to calm her. He talked to her, speaking in a steady stream of reassurance, asking her questions to keep her conscious and focused. Where was she from? Did she have family nearby? What was she doing on this road? The answers came in fragmented whispers, but they kept her tethered to the moment. When the sirens finally arrived, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, and he reluctantly released Catherine's hand as they began the careful work of extraction. As they loaded her into the ambulance, her eyes found his, and in that brief moment of connection, something unspoken passed between them, a wordless acknowledgement of the proximity to catastrophe and the strange grace of a stranger's kindness at the moment of crisis. Marcus followed the ambulance to Mercy Hospital, still wearing his work clothes, still covered in grease and the dust of the embankment. The fluorescent lights of Mercy Hospital's surgical recovery ward hummed with a frequency that seemed designed to wear down the human spirit. Catherine Morrison lay in bed 412, staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, and tried not to think about the fact that she could no longer feel anything below her waist. The surgery had taken 8 hours. The doctors had spoken to her in gentle tones, using words like incomplete spinal injury, nerve damage, and rehabilitation potential. But what they'd really said was this. The woman she'd been was gone, and the woman she would become was entirely unknown. 3 days had passed since the accident. 3 days of morphine drips, physical therapy consultations, and the slow, creeping realization that her body had betrayed her in ways she'd never imagined possible. The paralysis had set in immediately after the accident, and the surgery had revealed why. 2 vertebrae in her lumbar spine had been crushed, and though the neurosurgeons had worked carefully to stabilize the injury, the nerve damage was extensive and likely permanent. Catherine had spent most of her adult life in control of her appearance, her schedule, her environment, her future. That sense of agency had been the thread holding her together for the past 15 years, the reason she'd been able to walk away from her family's empire and build a new life on her own terms. And now, in a single moment of inattention on a rural Pennsylvania highway, control had been wrested away. She couldn't even control her own bladder anymore. something that filled her with a shame so profound that she'd wept for the first time since waking up after surgery. The hospital social worker had visited on the second day with a folder of pamphlets and a list of rehabilitation facilities. Most of them looked like institutions designed to house people the world had forgotten about, places with names like Sunrise Care Community and Pathways to Recovery, their websites featuring cheerful stock photos of smiling elderly people in wheelchairs doing art therapy. Catherine had politely declined each suggestion, not yet ready to accept that she would need to be warehoused anywhere at all. She had insurance, at least. That was something. Her health plan, purchased through a private carrier, would cover the initial rehabilitation and a reasonable amount of physical therapy. But the coverage limits were strict, and the out-of-pocket costs loomed like a storm on the horizon. The hospital bills alone would probably reach 6 figures. The long-term care, if she even survived this intact, if she found any purpose in living as a person who couldn't walk, would exceed anything her modest savings could cover. Catherine had worked as a consultant in recent years, helping small businesses streamline their operations. It was meaningful work, if modest, and it paid well enough to cover her simple lifestyle. But there was no consulting from a hospital bed, and there would be no consulting from a rehabilitation facility either. Without income, her savings would evaporate in months. The mathematics of catastrophe were brutally simple. On the morning of her 5th day in the hospital, Marcus Chen walked into her room carrying a bouquet of flowers from the hospital gift shop. They were the kind of flowers people bought when they didn't know what else to do, carnations in primary colors, arranged in a plastic vase. Catherine felt her throat tighten at the sight of him. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, settling into the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her bed. He'd visited every day since the accident, always coming after work, still wearing his work clothes or having quickly changed into jeans and a button-up shirt. There was a consistency to his presence that Catherine found oddly comforting. "Like I've been hit by a car," Catherine said, attempting humor. It came out hollow. Marcus smiled anyway, understanding that she was trying. He set the flowers on the windowsill and sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "My daughter Emma is 12, he said, seemingly out of nowhere. "When she was 6, she broke her arm falling off a jungle gym. I remember thinking the cast was permanent, that she'd never climb again, never do all the things kids do. But she healed. Within 6 months, you wouldn't have known anything had happened." "That's different," Catherine said quietly. "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged. "But my point is, the body is more resilient than we think. You're going to surprise yourself with what you can do." Catherine wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she would somehow return to her old life, or at least something resembling it. But the physical therapist had been honest with her that morning. Incomplete spinal injuries were unpredictable, but the likelihood of full recovery was minimal. She might regain some function, might learn to walk with assistance, or might not. Time would tell. In the meantime, she would need to learn an entirely new way of existing in the world. "The doctors want to discharge me in another week," Catherine said, changing the subject. "To a rehabilitation facility. I'm trying to decide which one." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's good. Rehabilitation will help." "I'm terrified," Catherine admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. She hadn't told anyone, not the doctors, not her estranged family whom she'd finally allowed the hospital to contact, not even herself until this moment. "I'm terrified of being stuck, of being dependent on strangers." Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were choosing words that might crack under the wrong pressure. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "And I want you to say no if it's not right, because I know we barely know each other. But Catherine, I can't stop thinking about how you helped me that day, how you kept talking to me, kept me focused. You were the one who was calm when everything was falling apart." Catherine frowned slightly. That wasn't how she remembered it. She remembered Marcus as the strong one, the capable one, the stranger who'd pulled her from the wreckage. "I know what you're thinking," Marcus continued. but you gave me something to hold on to. And now I'm thinking, what if I return the favor? Not in a hospital, not in some facility, but in your life, your real life." "What are you saying?" Catherine asked, though she thought she understood. "I'm saying," Marcus said slowly, "that if you'd let me I could help you. I know you don't have family nearby. I know the thought of being in a facility with strangers frightens you. So what if you came home to your apartment or wherever you live and I helped you with the logistics? Physical therapy appointments, medications, daily tasks. I could rearrange my work schedule. I'm not rich, so I can't help with money, but I can help with time. And sometimes time is what matters most." Catherine stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering. It was impractical, she knew. It was a burden he couldn't afford to carry. A stranger couldn't just reorganize his entire life for someone he'd met on the worst day of her existence. And yet something in his face, the determination, the genuine care, the absence of pity, made her want to say yes with a desperation that surprised her. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Because," he said finally, "someone did it for me once a long time ago, and I never got to repay them. Maybe this is how I repay that debt, not to them but forward, to you." Catherine felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the second time since the accident, and this time they were tears of something other than despair. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of the strange and unexpected grace of kindness from a stranger. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll let you help me." 3 months after Catherine's discharge from the hospital, the small apartment on Elm Street had become something like a home within a home. The unit was a modest 2-bedroom that Catherine had rented for the past 5 years, a place she'd chosen specifically for its quietness and anonymity. It wasn't luxurious, but it was hers, or had been until the accident made it suddenly complicated. The bathroom doorway had required widening to accommodate her wheelchair. A ramp had been installed at the front entrance. The bedroom furniture had been rearranged to create space for the medical equipment that had become as much a part of her life as breathing. Marcus had become part of that routine, with the casualness of someone stepping into a role he was born to play. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings began at 7:30 a.m. when Marcus arrived at Catherine's apartment with coffee from the diner 2 blocks away. He remembered how she took it: 1 sugar, a splash of cream, in a ceramic mug rather than a paper cup, because she'd mentioned, once in passing, that she disliked waste. These small observations had accumulated over the weeks, until Marcus had built a comprehensive internal map of Catherine's preferences. The specific physical therapy exercises that made her grimace, the novels she preferred to audiobooks, her tendency to withdraw into silence when she was in pain but didn't want to admit it. The physical therapy appointments were the centerpiece of their routine. Catherine's rehabilitation had progressed further than even her optimistic physical therapist had predicted. The initial paralysis had been incomplete, and after 3 months of rigorous, often painful therapy, Catherine had regained some sensation and limited mobility in her lower limbs. She couldn't walk, likely would never walk without assistance again, but she could transfer herself into a wheelchair with minimal help, could perform basic exercises to maintain muscle tone, and had developed a kind of fierce determination that bordered on obsessive. Again, she would demand during exercises, her teeth gritted, her hands gripping the parallel bars that Marcus had helped install in her living room. 1 more set. "Your therapist said," Marcus would begin. "I don't care what my therapist said, I need to do more." There was a stubbornness in her that Marcus recognized from his own nature. Catherine drove herself with the intensity of someone trying to outrun something, whether it was her disability, her past, or simply the vast emptiness of having lost control. Marcus wasn't sure, but he never pushed her to talk about it. Instead, he spotted her through the exercises, offered water when she needed it, and provided the steady presence of someone who believed she could do more than everyone else thought possible. Between appointments, they fell into the rhythm of ordinary life. Marcus would help Catherine with tasks that had become impossible after her injury. Showering required assistance with balance and transfer. Reaching high shelves required a partner. Some days simple tasks like opening a jar demanded help. But what surprised both of them was that these moments of dependency never felt humiliating. Marcus had a way of treating each task as practical necessity rather than pity, and Catherine had begun to see asking for help not as weakness but as pragmatism. They talked constantly, though Catherine remained carefully vague about her personal history. Marcus learned that she'd worked in business, that she'd traveled extensively in her younger years, that she'd made a deliberate choice to step away from a demanding career. But when he gently probed for more details, Catherine would deflect with practiced ease. "Did you have a family?" he'd asked once carefully, over the pasta dinner he'd brought from a local restaurant. "Family is complicated," Catherine had replied, twirling noodles on her fork. "Let's just say I'm estranged from most of them. It was a mutual decision." "Do you regret it?" Marcus pressed. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "but I regret the way it happened. I regret the things that were said. I regret that it took me this long to realize that leaving was the right choice." Marcus had asked no further questions, sensing the boundary she'd drawn. Whatever Catherine's past contained, whatever had driven her to abandon her family, it was a wound that hadn't fully healed. He recognized the signs, the way her jaw tightened when certain topics came up, the faraway look in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching, the careful way she'd reorganized her life into something small and manageable and safe. What he did notice was that Catherine seemed increasingly reluctant to discuss her recovery timeline or make plans beyond the next week. When her physical therapist mentioned vocational rehabilitation, the possibility of Catherine returning to some form of work, she became evasive. "I don't know what I'm capable of anymore," she'd said, and Marcus heard in her voice not just the physical limitation but something deeper, a loss of identity. It was during the 8th week that Marcus began to see real change in Catherine beyond the physical. She'd started cooking again, simple things at first, recipes she could manage from her wheelchair. Then more ambitious projects. One afternoon, Marcus arrived to find the apartment filled with the smell of garlic and basil, and Catherine teaching herself to chop vegetables while seated, adapting her technique to her new reality. "My grandmother taught me this," Catherine said, explaining the pasta sauce she was preparing. "She was an incredible cook. She tried to teach my mother, but my mother never had the patience for it. I'm trying to remember the recipe the way she made it." These were the moments Marcus treasured, when Catherine spoke about her past with something other than guardedness, when she allowed herself to be more than the sum of her injuries and limitations. By the 12th week, a pattern had solidified that neither of them acknowledged explicitly but both recognized as permanent. This was their life now. Marcus's garage job had become something he worked around rather than the center of his existence. He'd negotiated with his boss to work earlier hours and take Mondays off entirely. It meant less money, but it also meant a kind of peace he hadn't known he was looking for. Catherine, for her part, had begun to accept her new reality not with resignation, but with the kind of grace that comes from facing the thing you fear and discovering you're stronger than you thought. She still had dark days, still had moments of despair when she looked at her legs and felt nothing but rage at her body's betrayal. But those moments were interspersed with something unexpected: contentment. One evening, as Marcus was helping her prepare for bed, Catherine reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Marcus asked, though he knew. "For treating me like a person, not like a patient, not like someone to be pitied." Catherine's eyes glistened, but she smiled, "just like someone who matters." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a settling of certainty that this wasn't temporary, that whatever this was between them, this unlikely friendship born of accident and kindness, was something rare and real. "You do matter," he said, "more than you probably realize." Catherine squeezed his hand again, and in that grip was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. The foundation of a trust so complete that it would eventually allow her to reveal the carefully constructed lie her entire new life had been built upon. It happened on a Thursday afternoon during Catherine's final physical therapy session, before the appointment schedule would transition to once-weekly maintenance visits. Marcus had driven her to Mercy Hospital, the same building where she'd spent those dark weeks after her surgery, and had settled into his usual chair in the waiting area while the therapist worked with Catherine in the treatment room. He was reading an article on his phone about a new engine technology when he noticed the man. The stranger was tall, probably in his 60s, with the kind of bearing that suggested someone accustomed to authority. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that fit perfectly across broad shoulders, and his silver hair was precisely trimmed. There was something in his face, the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, that tugged at Marcus's memory, though he couldn't place why. The man approached the reception desk with the confidence of someone used to getting answers. "I'm looking for Catherine Morrison," he said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that suggested expensive education and inherited wealth. "She was admitted here after an accident a few months ago. I need to know where she is now." The receptionist, a woman named Susan whom Marcus had come to know by name, shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't release patient information without authorization. If you'd like to leave your name and number, I can try to pass along a message." The man's jaw tightened visibly. His fingers drummed against the desk in a gesture that spoke of impatience and frustration. "This is urgent. Catherine Morrison is. She's family. I need to speak with her." "Then I'm sure she'll call you if she has your information," Susan said with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd had this conversation many times. "But I can't help you without her permission." The man stared at the desk for a long moment, and Marcus saw something in his expression shift, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. He pulled out a leather wallet, extracted a business card, and slid it across the desk. "If she does come through here again, please make sure she gets this. It's important." Marcus watched as the man turned and walked toward the exit, his movements fluid but somehow weighted with exhaustion. There was something about him that suggested recent sleeplessness, a tension around the eyes that spoke of worry. It wasn't until after Catherine's therapy session ended, as Marcus was helping her back into the car, that he mentioned it casually. "Someone came by looking for you today at the hospital. A man older, wearing a really expensive suit. Didn't say his name." Catherine's entire body went rigid. Her hands, which had been resting on the transfer board, suddenly gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. "What did he look like?" Her voice had changed, become sharp in a way Marcus had never heard before. Marcus glanced at her, nodding the pallor that had drained the color from her face. Tall, silver hair, maybe 60 or so. He had this way of standing like he was used to being listened to. He asked the receptionist for your information, but she wouldn't give it to him. "What else?" Catherine pressed, urgency vibrating through her words. "Did he say anything else? Did he seem angry?" "No, actually, he seemed more worried, I guess. He left a business card." Marcus navigated the car onto the main road, stealing concerned glances at his passenger. "Catherine, what's going on? Do you know who that was?" Catherine didn't respond immediately. Her hands were shaking, and Marcus could see her breathing had become shallow. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I need to go home. I need to think." The drive back to the apartment was conducted in tense silence. Marcus wanted to press for answers, but something in Catherine's demeanor warned him that pushing would be counterproductive. Whatever this was, it had genuinely frightened her. Once they were inside the apartment and Catherine had transferred to her regular wheelchair, Marcus made tea, chamomile, which she'd mentioned once helped her sleep, and waited. He'd learned that Catherine needed space to process things, that forcing conversation too quickly would only cause her to retreat further. It took an hour. Catherine was sitting by the window, watching the street below when she finally broke the silence. "The man you saw," she said, not turning to look at Marcus. "I think it was my brother, Robert. I haven't seen him in 15 years." "Your brother," Marcus repeated, moving to sit in the chair across from her. "I thought you were estranged from your family. You made it sound like—" "I am," Catherine interrupted. Her voice carried a weight of finality, but underneath it was something fragile. "But that doesn't mean they've stopped looking for me." Marcus waited, sensing there was more. Catherine finally turned to face him, and he was struck by how vulnerable she looked, how small, despite her evident strength. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to promise that you won't judge me, that you won't see me differently." "Catherine, promise me, Marcus." "I promise," he said, meaning it. Catherine took a long breath. "My family is wealthy, very wealthy. My father built a company, Morrison Industries, that became one of the largest multinational corporations in the country. I grew up in that world. Prep schools, country clubs, summers in Europe. Everything was about the family business, about maintaining our position, about power and money and influence." Marcus listened quietly, beginning to understand why Catherine had been so evasive about her past. "My father passed away when I was 28, Catherine continued. "Under the terms of his will, control of the company was divided among my siblings and me. I inherited a significant stake and a seat on the board of directors. For a few years, I played the game. I wore the right clothes, said the right things, made the right investments. But the more involved I became, the more I realized what the company really was." She paused, her jaw tightening as memories surfaced. "We were exploiting workers in developing countries. We knew the conditions in our factories were inhumane, but the profit margins were too good to question. We were dumping chemical waste in ways that violated environmental regulations, but we had enough lawyers to keep the lawsuits at bay. We were lobbying for policies that hurt the people who could least afford it. Also, we could increase shareholder value by another percentage point." Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. "I tried to change things. I proposed new labor standards, environmental compliance initiatives, ethical sourcing protocols. My family listened politely and then ignored everything I said. They didn't see anything wrong with what we were doing. To them, it was simply business. The only morality that mattered was profit." "So you left," Marcus said, understanding dawning. "I resigned from the board when I was 43 years old," Catherine said. "I liquidated my stake in the company, which was worth a great deal of money, and walked away. My family saw it as a betrayal. My brother Robert, who's now the CEO, never forgave me. My mother called me selfish and ungrateful. My sister said I was throwing away my birthright for a meaningless gesture. The family basically disowned me." "But you had the money from the sale?" Marcus asked. "I did," Catherine confirmed. "But I didn't want to live like that anymore. I sold the house I'd inherited, cut my lifestyle down to something modest, and tried to build a new identity. I started consulting, legitimate work, helping small businesses operate ethically. I volunteered. I lived quietly. And for 15 years, no one looked for me. No one cared where I'd gone." "Until the accident," Marcus said softly. "Until the accident," Catherine repeated. "When suddenly I was injured and vulnerable, and my family probably realized they could force me back into their world, that I couldn't refuse them from a hospital bed, that they could take care of me, but on their terms, in their way, which means reintegrating me into everything I worked so hard to escape." She looked directly at Marcus, and her eyes were wet. "I'm terrified, Marcus, not just of them, but of what I might become if I let them back in. I've spent 15 years running from that world, and I was finally starting to feel like I'd actually made it, that I was a person with integrity instead of a woman defined by her family's money. And now you need help," Marcus finished, "and the only people positioned to give it to you come with strings attached." "Exactly," Catherine whispered. "I don't know what to do." Marcus moved his chair closer and took her hand. "You keep doing what you've been doing," he said firmly. You keep building a life on your own terms, and you let me help not because of your family or their money, but because we're friends, because I believe in you, because this matters." Catherine's hand trembled in his, and she squeezed it like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. "Thank you," she said, though the words seemed insufficient for what she was feeling. It happened on a Thursday afternoon during Catherine's final physical therapy session, before the appointment schedule would transition to once-weekly maintenance visits. Marcus had driven her to Mercy Hospital, the same building where she'd spent those dark weeks after her surgery, and had settled into his usual chair in the waiting area while the therapist worked with Catherine in the treatment room. He was reading an article on his phone about a new engine technology when he noticed the man. The stranger was tall, probably in his 60s, with the kind of bearing that suggested someone accustomed to authority. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that fit perfectly across broad shoulders, and his silver hair was precisely trimmed. There was something in his face, the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, that tugged at Marcus's memory, though he couldn't place why. The man approached the reception desk with the confidence of someone used to getting answers. "I'm looking for Catherine Morrison," he said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that suggested expensive education and inherited wealth. "She was admitted here after an accident a few months ago. I need to know where she is now." The receptionist, a woman named Susan whom Marcus had come to know by name, shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't release patient information without authorization. If you'd like to leave your name and number, I can try to pass along a message." The man's jaw tightened visibly. His fingers drummed against the desk in a gesture that spoke of impatience and frustration. "This is urgent. Catherine Morrison is. She's family. I need to speak with her." "Then I'm sure she'll call you if she has your information," Susan said with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd had this conversation many times. "But I can't help you without her permission." The man stared at the desk for a long moment, and Marcus saw something in his expression shift, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. He pulled out a leather wallet, extracted a business card, and slid it across the desk. "If she does come through here again, please make sure she gets this. It's important." Marcus watched as the man turned and walked toward the exit, his movements fluid but somehow weighted with exhaustion. There was something about him that suggested recent sleeplessness, a tension around the eyes that spoke of worry. It wasn't until after Catherine's therapy session ended, as Marcus was helping her back into the car, that he mentioned it casually. "Someone came by looking for you today at the hospital. A man older, wearing a really expensive suit. Didn't say his name." Catherine's entire body went rigid. Her hands, which had been resting on the transfer board, suddenly gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. "What did he look like?" Her voice had changed, become sharp in a way Marcus had never heard before. Marcus glanced at her, nodding the pallor that had drained the color from her face. Tall, silver hair, maybe 60 or so. He had this way of standing like he was used to being listened to. He asked the receptionist for your information, but she wouldn't give it to him. "What else?" Catherine pressed, urgency vibrating through her words. "Did he say anything else? Did he seem angry?" "No, actually, he seemed more worried, I guess. He left a business card." Marcus navigated the car onto the main road, stealing concerned glances at his passenger. "Catherine, what's going on? Do you know who that was?" Catherine didn't respond immediately. Her hands were shaking, and Marcus could see her breathing had become shallow. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I need to go home. I need to think." The drive back to the apartment was conducted in tense silence. Marcus wanted to press for answers, but something in Catherine's demeanor warned him that pushing would be counterproductive. Whatever this was, it had genuinely frightened her. Once they were inside the apartment and Catherine had transferred to her regular wheelchair, Marcus made tea, chamomile, which she'd mentioned once helped her sleep, and waited. He'd learned that Catherine needed space to process things, that forcing conversation too quickly would only cause her to retreat further. It took an hour. Catherine was sitting by the window, watching the street below when she finally broke the silence. "The man you saw," she said, not turning to look at Marcus. "I think it was my brother, Robert. I haven't seen him in 15 years. "Your brother," Marcus repeated, moving to sit in the chair across from her. "I thought you were estranged from your family. You made it sound like—" "I am," Catherine interrupted. Her voice carried a weight of finality, but underneath it was something fragile. "But that doesn't mean they've stopped looking for me." Marcus waited, sensing there was more. Catherine finally turned to face him, and he was struck by how vulnerable she looked, how small despite her evident strength. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to promise that you won't judge me, that you won't see me differently." "Catherine, promise me, Marcus." "I promise," he said, meaning it. Catherine took a long breath. "My family is wealthy, very wealthy. My father built a company, Morrison Industries, that became one of the largest multinational corporations in the country. I grew up in that world. Prep schools, country clubs, summers in Europe. Everything was about the family business, about maintaining our position, about power and money and influence." Marcus listened quietly, beginning to understand why Catherine had been so evasive about her past. "My father passed away when I was 28, Catherine continued. "Under the terms of his will, control of the company was divided among my siblings and me. I inherited a significant stake and a seat on the board of directors. For a few years, I played the game. I wore the right clothes, said the right things, made the right investments. But the more involved I became, the more I realized what the company really was." She paused, her jaw tightening as memories surfaced. "We were exploiting workers in developing countries. We knew the conditions in our factories were inhumane, but the profit margins were too good to question. We were dumping chemical waste in ways that violated environmental regulations, but we had enough lawyers to keep the lawsuits at bay. We were lobbying for policies that hurt the people who could least afford it. Also, we could increase shareholder value by another percentage point." Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. "I tried to change things. I proposed new labor standards, environmental compliance initiatives, ethical sourcing protocols. My family listened politely and then ignored everything I said. They didn't see anything wrong with what we were doing. To them, it was simply business. The only morality that mattered was profit." "So you left," Marcus said, understanding dawning. "I resigned from the board when I was 43 years old," Catherine said. "I liquidated my stake in the company, which was worth a great deal of money, and walked away. My family saw it as a betrayal. My brother Robert, who's now the CEO, never forgave me. My mother called me selfish and ungrateful. My sister said I was throwing away my birthright for a meaningless gesture. The family basically disowned me." "But you had the money from the sale?" Marcus asked. "I did," Catherine confirmed. "But I didn't want to live like that anymore. I sold the house I'd inherited, cut my lifestyle down to something modest, and tried to build a new identity. I started consulting, legitimate work, helping small businesses operate ethically. I volunteered. I lived quietly. And for 15 years, no one looked for me. No one cared where I'd gone." "Until the accident," Marcus said softly. "Until the accident," Catherine repeated. "When suddenly I was injured and vulnerable, and my family probably realized they could force me back into their world, that I couldn't refuse them from a hospital bed, that they could take care of me, but on their terms, in their way, which means reintegrating me into everything I worked so hard to escape." She looked directly at Marcus, and her eyes were wet. "I'm terrified, Marcus. Not just of them, but of what I might become if I let them back in. I've spent 15 years running from that world, and I was finally starting to feel like I'd actually made it, that I was a person with integrity instead of a woman defined by her family's money. And now you need help," Marcus finished, "and the only people positioned to give it to you come with strings attached." "Exactly," Catherine whispered. "I don't know what to do." Marcus moved his chair closer and took her hand. "You keep doing what you've been doing," he said firmly. "You keep building a life on your own terms. And you let me help, not because of your family or their money, but because we're friends. Because I believe in you. Because this matters." Catherine's hand trembled in his, and she squeezed it like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. "Thank you," she said, though the words seemed insufficient for what she was feeling. The search began on a Saturday night, 3 days after Catherine's confession, while Marcus sat alone in his apartment above the takeout restaurant. He told himself it wasn't snooping, that it was simply due diligence, the kind of thing anyone would do upon learning that someone they cared about came from wealth and had deliberately hidden that fact. But if he was being honest with himself, it was curiosity. And perhaps, if he was even more honest, it was a need to understand exactly what he was getting himself into by standing by Catherine's side against her family. He opened his laptop on the small kitchen table and pulled up Google. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he typed, "Catherine Morrison." The results came back almost immediately, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. The first image was from a society page dated 15 years ago. It showed a woman in an elegant black evening gown at what appeared to be a charity gala. The woman had Catherine's distinctive bone structure, her sharp eyes, though the version in the photograph was styled differently. Hair professionally done, makeup perfect, the look of someone who'd been groomed from birth to inhabit that kind of space. But it was unmistakably her. The headline read, "Catherine Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, steps down amid family controversy." Marcus clicked on the article, his heart pounding. The text was dated 15 years prior, and it detailed Catherine's abrupt resignation from Morrison Industries, a multinational corporation with interests spanning pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, and logistics. The article quoted various sources, business analysts, family friends, who expressed shock at her decision to step away from a company valued at over $3 billion. An unusual move for someone with such significant family stake, one analyst had commented. The Morrison name is synonymous with corporate innovation and market leadership. Catherine's departure represents either a fundamental disagreement with company direction or a personal crisis of some kind. The article went on to mention that Catherine had liquidated her holdings, though exact figures weren't provided. It noted that her family had made no public statement about her departure, and that she was officially listed as pursuing private interests. Marcus scrolled through more search results. Business magazines from the early 2000s featured profiles of the Morrison family. There was her father, James Morrison Sr., who'd founded the company in 1963. Her mother, Helen, described as a philanthropist and society fixture. Her brother, Robert, now CEO, and her sister, Margaret, who sat on several boards. And Catherine, always described as brilliant, sometimes controversial, the idealistic Morrison who pushed for progressive policies in an otherwise conservative corporation. One article from a business journal caught his eye: Morrison Industries under fire. Labor practices in Southeast Asian facilities draw criticism. The article detailed complaints from worker advocacy groups about conditions in the company's manufacturing plants, substandard safety protocols, excessive working hours, inadequate compensation, environmental violations in Cambodia and Vietnam. The article included a quote from Catherine Morrison: "I've proposed comprehensive reforms to our labor standards. I believe Morrison Industries can lead the industry in ethical manufacturing practices without compromising profitability. Unfortunately, my proposals have not been supported by the board." That was dated just before her resignation. Marcus sat back in his chair, trying to process what he was reading. Catherine wasn't just from a wealthy family. She wasn't just moderately rich. She was the former CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. She was a woman who'd walked away from an empire because of her conscience. He continued reading, finding articles about Morrison Industries practices, the lawsuits the company had faced, and settled with non-disclosure agreements. The environmental impact studies that had been disputed, the accusations of union busting and worker exploitation. And Catherine had fought against it, or at least she'd tried. There was a photo gallery from a business dinner in 2009, one of her final appearances at a company event before her resignation. Catherine stood with her family, her father, who looked stern, her mother, who looked elegant, her siblings, who looked confident in the way of people who'd never questioned their right to be in any room. In the photo, Catherine was smiling, but Marcus could see something in her eyes that looked like resignation. Like someone watching a train they knew was headed for a cliff, unable to convince anyone to pull the brakes. By the time he finished his search, it was nearly 2 a.m. Marcus had filled pages of his notebook with information: Morrison Industries' stock price, the company's current market position, the wealth it had generated for the Morrison family, the controversies that had shadowed it for decades. Catherine had walked away from all of that. She'd voluntarily chosen poverty and obscurity over wealth and power, because the wealth and power came tainted with moral compromise. And he'd been helping her like she was just a woman who'd had bad luck, like she hadn't made a deliberate, conscious choice to build a completely different life. The emotions came in waves. First, betrayal: she'd lied to him, or at least she'd allowed him to believe a simpler story than the truth. Then amazement at her conviction, at the apparent integrity it had taken to walk away from $3 billion. Then fear, because if her family found her, if they brought her back into that world, the Marcus Chen she'd come to trust might not be enough to hold her to the person she'd become. He closed his laptop as dawn was breaking over the rooftops of the small town, casting long shadows across his kitchen. He needed to confront her, but he also needed to understand exactly how he felt about what he'd discovered. By the time he arrived at Catherine's apartment on Monday morning, Marcus had rehearsed a dozen different opening lines. None of them felt right. Catherine was in the kitchen when he arrived, preparing vegetables for a salad. She looked up with a smile that immediately faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You lied," Marcus said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "About what?" Catherine's hand stilled on the knife she was holding. "About who you are, about everything." Marcus set his phone on the counter, Google search results still displayed on the screen. Catherine Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, net worth probably in the hundreds of millions. You didn't just come from money, you owned money, you owned a corporation. Catherine's face went very still. She set the knife down slowly and looked away from him, her shoulders curving inward in a posture of defeat. "I didn't lie," she said quietly. "I just didn't tell you everything." "That's the same thing," Marcus said, then immediately regretted the harshness in his tone. But the anger was there, swirling beneath every word. "We've spent 3 months together. You told me about your family, about why you left. You made it sound like you were some regular person who just decided to opt out. You never mentioned that you owned a billion-dollar company." "Would it have changed anything?" Catherine asked, still not looking at him. "Would you have helped me any differently if you'd known?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly, "but I would have known the truth. That matters." Catherine finally turned to face him and her eyes were red-rimmed. "The money was part of why I left," she said. "Part of why I hated it so much. Having that much power and being forced to use it in ways I couldn't accept. So yes, I walked away from it. I sold everything I could and built a new life. And for 15 years I was happy. I wasn't rich, but I was free." She gestured helplessly at her wheelchair. "And then the accident happened and suddenly I needed help and you offered it. And all I could think was that if you knew the truth, you'd either see me as the person I was trying to escape or you'd pity me for throwing it all away. And I needed you to see me as Catherine. Just Catherine, not Morrison Catherine." Marcus stood in silence, the anger mixing with understanding, with sadness, with the complicated emotions of discovering that someone you trust has been keeping secrets, even if those secrets were kept for reasons that made sense. "I don't know what to do with this," he said finally. "I know," Catherine replied, "but please, please don't leave, I can't." She didn't finish, but Marcus heard the vulnerability underneath the words. He couldn't leave. Not because of the money or the secret, but because underneath all of that was still Catherine, the woman who'd been kind to a stranger, who'd trusted him with her fragility, who'd slowly rebuilt herself from rubble. "We need to talk," Marcus said, "about everything." Catherine nodded, and as the morning light filled the kitchen, they began the difficult work of rebuilding trust from the foundation of betrayal. They sat across from each other at Catherine's small dining table for hours. The salad she'd been preparing went uneaten. The coffee Marcus had brought grew cold. Outside, the day moved forward with indifferent sunshine, but inside the apartment, time seemed to have paused while Catherine and Marcus navigated the complicated territory between anger and understanding. "Tell me everything," Marcus said finally, once he'd managed to process his initial shock. "Not the version for strangers, not the version you thought I needed to hear. The truth." Catherine took a breath and began to speak about the world she'd been born into. She described a childhood where every decision was calculated for advantage, where relationships were tools for networking, where love was conditional on performance and achievement. Her parents had been distant figures, her mother a perpetual hostess, her father an emperor of industry who measured his children's worth by their loyalty to the Morrison name. "My father didn't just build Morrison Industries," Catherine explained. "He built it as a dynasty. It wasn't enough that the company was successful. It had to be powerful, influential. It had to give the Morrison family a seat at every important table in the country. And all of us, my siblings and I, we understood from a young age that our lives belonged to that mission." She described her education at prestigious boarding schools, her summer internships at Morrison Industries, her inevitable rise through the corporate ranks. By the time she was 30, she'd been groomed to take over the company. Everyone expected it. Her siblings had accepted their secondary roles in the family hierarchy. "When my father died, I inherited his CEO position and a significant stake in the company," Catherine said. "I was brilliant at the job, Marcus. I understood business. I understood markets and strategy. I could see inefficiencies and fix them. I could identify opportunities and capitalize on them. But the more successful I became, the more I realized what success actually meant." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I discovered that we were knowingly operating factories in conditions that violated international labor standards. I found documents that showed we were aware of environmental violations, but had chosen to pay fines rather than fix the problems. I learned that we were actively lobbying against regulations that would protect workers or the environment, purely because those regulations might reduce our profit margin." Marcus listened quietly. "When I tried to change things, I expected resistance," Catherine continued. "I expected my siblings to push back. What I didn't expect was how personal it became. My mother said I was betraying the family legacy. My brother Robert said I was naive and destructive. They acted like I was attacking them personally, when all I was doing was asking the company to treat people decently." Her voice had become strained, and Marcus could see the old wounds reopening. "The final straw came when I discovered that we were knowingly concealing a defect in one of our pharmaceutical products," Catherine said. "A medication that people with chronic pain were depending on. We knew it had dangerous side effects when combined with other medications, side effects that could cause heart attacks or strokes. And we knew this. We had the research. But to fix it would mean recalling the drug, admitting the problem, paying out settlements. So instead, we buried the data." She looked directly at Marcus. "I told my father I couldn't be part of that. I told him I would resign if he didn't launch a recall. He told me I was either loyal to the family or I wasn't. There was no middle ground." "You chose to leave," Marcus said. "I chose to leave," Catherine confirmed. "But before I did, I made a choice that terrified me. I contacted a journalist, an investigative reporter who'd been trying to crack into Morrison Industries practices for years. I gave her everything: documents, emails, internal memos. I gave her the pharmaceutical cover-up, the labor violations, the environmental destruction. I gave her the family's knowing participation in all of it. Marcus's eyes widened. You exposed them. I exposed us, Catherine said quietly. The story broke 2 weeks before I officially resigned. It was a scandal. Federal investigations were launched. The company faced massive lawsuits. My family claimed I'd betrayed them, and technically they were right. But what no one ever acknowledged was that I was also the one who tried to prevent the betrayal of human beings for profit. She looked out the window, her expression distant. My mother said I was ungrateful. My father said I was a traitor. Robert said I destroyed everything he'd inherited. Margaret just stopped speaking to me, and I accepted that as the price of my conscience. Marcus tried to imagine it, walking away from family, from wealth, from everything she'd known, and doing it publicly, visibly, with the world watching to see what the disgraced Morrison daughter would do next. How did you survive? He asked. Financially, I mean, if you gave up the inheritance. I didn't give it all up immediately, Catherine said. My father's will left me a trust fund, money that was technically mine but that I'd been unwilling to touch because I didn't want to benefit from his corruption. But after I exposed Morrison Industries after the scandal, I liquidated everything. I sold the trust fund, sold the houses, sold the investments. I took probably $30 million in liquid assets and distributed most of it to organizations working on labor rights and environmental protection. I kept enough to buy the apartment, build a modest savings, and live simply. $30 million, Marcus repeated numbly. To most people, that's incomprehensible, Catherine said. To my family, it was insulting. They thought I was being theatrical, making a grand gesture. They couldn't understand that I genuinely didn't want that money, that keeping it would have meant continuing to be complicit in the harm it represented. She turned back to him. So I became Catherine the consultant, Catherine who worked with small businesses and nonprofits, who helped them do ethical things that made modest money. Catherine who bought one change of clothes for the week and shopped at the farmer's market on Saturdays and actually cared about the people she worked with. You built a completely different life, Marcus said. I built a life where I could look at myself in the mirror, Catherine corrected. For 15 years I was happy, Marcus. I wasn't wealthy, but I had something better. I had integrity. I had peace. And then the accident happened and suddenly I was vulnerable again, and my family saw an opportunity to pull me back. Do you think they know you gave the story to the journalist? Marcus asked. They've always suspected, Catherine said, but there was never proof. I was careful about that. The journalist protected me completely, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm still the family member who turned against them, who exposed them, who chose conscience over loyalty. Marcus stood up and moved around the table. Without speaking, he knelt beside Catherine's wheelchair and took her hand. I'm sorry I got angry, he said. I'm sorry I made you feel like you needed to hide from me. But Catherine, what you did, walking away from that world, living with integrity, fighting for what's right, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be incredibly proud of. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid you'd see me as a failure, someone who threw away billions of dollars, who betrayed her family, who thought she was better than everyone else. I see someone who had the courage to choose principle over privilege, Marcus said, and I see someone I respect more now than I did yesterday. Catherine reached for him, and they held each other in the quiet apartment, while the afternoon light moved across the floor, marking time in this moment where everything between them had been broken open and rebuilt, stronger than before. 3 weeks after their honest conversation, Catherine's physical therapist made an observation that changed everything. During a session focused on range of motion and core strengthening, the therapist, a woman named Dr. Alina Chen, who'd been working with Catherine since her discharge, paused mid-exercise and smiled with genuine pleasure. "You're making remarkable progress," Dr. Chen said. "Your muscle tone is significantly improved, your pain levels are decreasing, and your psychological approach to your recovery is the best I've seen. Most people in your situation plateau around the 3-month mark, but you're not plateauing. You're actually improving." After the session, as Marcus drove Catherine home, she was unusually quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than the retreating silence he'd learned to recognize. This was the silence of someone thinking, planning, imagining possibility. That evening, as they sat on the small balcony of her apartment watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, Catherine finally spoke about what was on her mind. "I've been thinking about the future," she said. "Not just my recovery, but what comes after that. What my life looks like once I've adjusted to this new reality." Marcus waited, sensing this was important. "When I left Morrison Industries, I thought I wanted to disappear," Catherine continued. "I thought I wanted to be nobody, someone without influence, without power, without the burden of inherited wealth. And that was the right choice for a while. I needed to prove to myself that I could be a person of integrity, that I could make decisions based on principle rather than profit." She paused, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. "But the accident showed me something I'd been avoiding," Catherine said. "It showed me that there are so many people who fall through the cracks, people like I could have been if I hadn't had education and resources. People who suffer catastrophic injuries and have nowhere to turn because they lack insurance, lack family support, lack basic access to the rehabilitation and support that might change their lives." "Where are you going with this?" Marcus asked gently. "I want to do something," Catherine said. "Something meaningful. Something that uses the resources I have to actually help people, not through Morrison Industries, which will always be tainted by its corruption, but through something new, something clean." She turned to look at him directly. "I want to establish a foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting people with spinal injuries and paralysis who lack resources. We could provide scholarships for physical therapy, help with accessibility modifications to their homes, create mentoring programs connecting newly injured people with long-term survivors. We could fund research. We could be advocates. We could actually change people's lives." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "That's a beautiful idea," he said carefully, "but Catherine, that's a massive undertaking. I'd need someone with integrity," Catherine interrupted. "Someone who understands what it means to struggle, to work hard, to value people over profit. Someone who isn't motivated by money or status but by genuine compassion." She paused. "I'd need you, Marcus." "Catherine." "As co-director," she continued, speaking quickly as if she needed to get it all out before he could refuse. "I have the resources to fund it initially. I have knowledge of nonprofit structures and governance from my consulting work. But what I need, is someone who understands people, someone who can connect with individuals from a place of empathy, not charity, someone who can build programs that actually address real needs." Marcus shook his head. "I'm a mechanic, I fix cars, I'm not a nonprofit administrator, I don't have the expertise." "You have more expertise than you realize," Catherine said. "You understand problems and solutions. You understand people who have had bad luck and are trying to make the best of it. You understand dignity. And you learn quickly. I've seen that over the past few months." "I can't just quit my job," Marcus protested. "I need the income." "You won't need the income," Catherine said. "The foundation would employ you as co-director. It would be a salary, a good one, appropriate for the work. And Marcus, it would be work that matters, work that actually changes lives." Marcus stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, looking out over the town that had been his entire life. He thought about the garage, about the satisfaction of fixing something broken, about coming home every night exhausted, and knowing that what he'd done was useful but ultimately replaceable. Someone else could fix those cars. But this, the work Catherine was describing, this felt essential in a way his current life never had. "I'm not qualified," he said finally, returning to the argument he could articulate. Neither was I when I started working in consulting, Catherine replied. But I learned, and you'll learn too. We'll learn together. Marcus, you saved my life twice, once on that highway and once by believing that I was worth saving. Let me give you the opportunity to save other lives. Let me give you the chance to build something meaningful. He wanted to say yes. Every part of him wanted to say yes. But fear held him back, fear of failure, of not being good enough, of disappointing Catherine, of stepping into a world he didn't understand. Think about it, Catherine said, as if reading his thoughts. Don't answer now, but please consider it. The consideration lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks of Marcus going to the garage, of fixing cars, of coming home to the apartment above the takeout restaurant, and feeling the weight of a life that suddenly seemed too small. 2 weeks of lying awake at night imagining what it would be like to work alongside Catherine, to build something from nothing, to help people the way he'd helped her. The decision came on a Thursday, when a customer came into the garage, a man whose teenage son had been paralyzed in a car accident. The man was desperate, asking Marcus if he could recommend any resources, any programs that might help his son adjust to life in a wheelchair. Marcus had nothing to offer him but sympathy and the names of a few rehabilitation facilities. As the man left, looking more defeated than when he'd arrived, Marcus realized that this could be different. With Catherine's foundation, Marcus could offer hope. He could offer actual help. He texted Catherine, "Yes." Her response came back immediately, "Yes to what?" "Yes to everything, let's do this." 2 hours later, they were sitting at her dining table with notebooks and laptops, beginning to outline the Morrison Foundation's mission statement. Catherine worked with focused intensity, but it was Marcus who suggested the first real innovation, reaching out directly to people in hospitals, offering support at the moment of crisis when they were most vulnerable and most open to hope. "That's where we start," Marcus said, seeing it clearly. "That's where I would have appreciated someone reaching out to me if I'd ever faced what Catherine faced, in that moment of absolute despair when the future looks impossible." By the time he left that night, Marcus had made the decision to give his notice at the garage. He'd been the manager for 7 years, and his boss was disappointed but understanding. "I always knew you were meant for something bigger," the old man had said, which should have comforted Marcus, but instead filled him with terror at the enormity of what he was committing to. But when he looked at Catherine's face, lit up with possibility and purpose for the first time since the accident, he knew he'd made the right choice. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about both of them, building something that could matter to thousands of people. The Morrison Foundation was born on that Thursday evening, not with incorporation papers or official registration, but with 2 people who'd started as strangers and become partners, standing together on the edge of something unknown and choosing to leap anyway.